Moses is considered the greatest prophet and spiritual leader of the Hebrew scriptures, according to the rabbis. God spoke to him in a very unique and special way. All the signs and wonders and miracles that he performed in the sight of the Jewish people. And it was through his hand that God gave the Torah and the 10 Commandments. He was used so powerfully, different than any other leader in the history of Israel. But what endeared him to God? What made Moses beloved was not his eloquence, because he wasn't, or his great gifting, but it was because he was the humblest man in all of the earth. It was Moses's humility. And God himself attests to this truth. You remember the story where Aaron, his brother, and Miriam, his sister, complain about him, thinking that he was elevating himself above the people? And what does God say? My servant Moses is the humblest man in all of the earth. Imagine God saying that about you. What marked Moses more than any other leader was Moses' extreme degree of humility. Moses' humility is attested to in a very unique way, what I call the mystery of the small olive. The third book of the Bible is known as Leviticus, but in Hebrew it's known as Vayikra, and he called. When God told Moses to write that first word of the third book, Moses did not want to write that God called him. He was so humble, he didn't want to write that about himself. So God made a compromise with Moses. He let him write the Hebrew word Vayikra, the last letter, with a small letter Aleph. That small letter Aleph, which is still in the Hebrew scroll to this day, attests to and point to Moses' humility. What does it remind us of? What's the lesson that we can learn from it? What does it teach us about the definition of humility? What it shows us is that smallness is the way to greatness. If you want to be great, you have to become small in your own sight. And we see this from the very beginning of God's call to Moses. When God called Moses in the burning bush, Moses actually didn't want to go, and he resisted the Lord. He resisted the Lord because he was actually too humble. And that's something we have to understand. I believe one of the best definitions of humility is occupying the right amount of space. When we occupy too much space, we become prideful. When we try to occupy too little space, that's false humility. Moses at the burning bush did not want to occupy the fullness of the place and the space that God had determined for him. And ultimately, God had to kind of rebuke him for him to rise up and step up, to come out of that false sense of humility. There's that old business expression, don't leave anything on the table. I don't want to leave anything on the table that he paid such a high price to purchase. We have to occupy the fullness of the promise, like the children of Israel were to occupy the entirety of the promised land. When you think about a great leader, there's people with great charismatic personalities and great gifting and reach and impact a lot of people, and they kind of can mesmerize a crowd. But think about it for a moment. Are they humble? Do they care about other people? Do they make space for others? A great leader is not the one who has the loudest voice or can get the most attention. Truly, a great leader from a biblical perspective is someone who's humble. And we see this in the numbers, because the numerical value of Messiah in Hebrew, Mashiach, is 358. And 358 is also the numerical value of the Hebrew expression, Eved Ivri, Hebrew servant. What does this tell us? That the Messiah was going to be the ultimate embodiment of a Hebrew servant. We're called to be servant leaders. In other words, we're called to be humble. Charisma without character always leads to chaos. Moses was one of the humblest leaders to ever exist, and he was one of the greatest leaders in Israel's history. Yeshua was an even greater leader, and he was even more humble. We need to embody their type of humility, because smallness is always the way to greatness. And I believe a great way to understand humility is that humility is occupying the right amount of space. When we occupy the right amount of space, we leave room for God and we leave room for the voice of God to speak into our lives. Because you can't be full of God and full of yourself at the same time. So truly, we need humility. It's one of the foundational traits we need if God is going to use us to make a difference. There's another side to this as well, which is false humility. And false humility can be really dangerous.
Rabbi Jason, what is false humility and why is it dangerous?
Yeah, I think it's important to define. So pride is occupying too much space, doesn't leave space for God or for others. But false humility is exactly the opposite. It's occupying too little space. So it's thinking less of yourself than God actually thinks of you. And so God wants us to occupy our promise. And so many people will fall short of fully occupying their fullness of their promise because it's kind of like Moses, who's like called by God and he's like, Lord, I've got a problem with my mouth. Send somebody else, right? Well, that was kind of a false humility to start, because if God tells you you're called and to go do it, he's going to give you the ability to do what he's asked you to do. And so many times God calls us to do something, we're like, oh, I'm so worthless. I'm not gifted at all. I could never even do that. Even if God asked me to do it, surely, whether we say it or not, it's like somehow he made the mistake, right? God didn't make a mistake when he created you, and the gifts and abilities that he's given you wasn't by accident. And so we need to break away and not allow that false sense of humility to cripple us and keep us back from fulfilling God's calling and stepping into his promises for our life.
What are some keys, or how do I walk out keeping myself in check? Is there a checklist for keeping yourself in check? What can I do to make sure I'm keeping the main thing?
I think there's some really practical ways that we can see how are we doing in the department of humility, right? And I think one of those ways is, how do we respond to insults, right? A humble person is a person who doesn't take offense, because a humble person is someone who has died to themselves. I've never seen at a funeral someone look at a corpse and say, man, they don't look that hot, and the corpse get offended, right? When we're humble, we've died to self, and there's not that spirit of offense when people say things that are hurtful or negative. Doesn't mean it doesn't hurt, but we choose not to lash out and try and get revenge or snap back. I think another aspect to humility is teachability. Can we learn from other people? Can we take constructive criticism? I mean, really, a truly humble person is someone who sees that they can learn from everyone.
So when God calls us to do something that feels really out of our comfort zone and we don't want to do it, how should we respond to that?
Yeah, I mean, God calls us all the time to do things that we don't necessarily feel comfortable with, or that we don't feel we have the gifting or ability to do. Every time I sit down to do something like this, there's some fear and trepidation and anxiety. What if I make a mistake? What if I make a fool of myself? Those kind of fears begin to creep in. But I think God calls us to take risks for him. Faith is spelled R-A-S-K. I mean, the reality is one thing I've had to learn is that at the end of the day, what's the worst that can happen, right? The worst that can happen is that I could die. And if I die, I get to go be with the Lord, right? So, I mean, at the end of the day, there's nothing so bad that can happen. And I think that if we don't take a risk, we'll never do anything great for God. And, even if we fall, even if we fail, it doesn't really make a difference, because God will honor the fact that we were willing to humble ourselves and do what he asked us to do. And in that, there's going to be growth there's going to be God's blessing on our life, and God's going to bring good out of it.